We begin with the tragic mystery of Maria Lorraine Hanzel. Night fell over Colorado Springs on February 7, 1977. 14-year-old Maria Lorraine Hanzel sat watching two toddlers inside a neighboring unit on the 5400 stretch of North Nevada Avenue. The resident stepped out for the night, leaving the teenager to keep watch. They placed their complete faith in this dependable girl to protect their slumbering toddlers. Arriving home just shy of midnight, the mother made a gruesome discovery. Maria lay in the main bedroom, her throat and chest ravaged by blade wounds. Miraculously, the little one slept through the entire nightmare completely untouched. Arriving officers harbored doubts about the nature of the carnage, until the El Paso County medical examiner definitively ruled the girl's brutal demise an outright murder. The perimeter was pristine. No shattered glass, no splintered door frames. This chilling detail meant the victim likely recognized her killer, or the predator simply twisted an unlocked knob. Dressed in a blue jumpsuit, her body rested amid a horrific expanse of crimson stains painting the bedroom. Detectives launched a relentless inquiry, interrogating relatives, adjacent tenants, and every possible soul linked to the teenager's vanishing timeline. Forensics scoured the room, carefully bagging biological traces alongside the victim's soaked blue garment, yet even chasing down endless tips. And questioning countless persons of interest, law enforcement hit a terrifying dead end. The trail ultimately froze, turning into just another forgotten 1970s ghost story while the physical clues gathered dust in an archive. Entire generations faded away without justice. Genetic material salvaged from the outfit generated a distinct male signature for the National Registry, only to echo back absolute silence. Those crucial biological fragments waited in the dark, biding time until forensic science could finally catch up to the killer. For almost half a century, grieving relatives carried the heavy burden of the unknown, desperately praying to unmask their child's butcher. A monumental shift occurred in 2019 when authorities handed the biological samples over to Parabon NanoLabs, an elite facility pioneering the dark frontier of ancestral tracing. Scientists fed the phantom's genetic code into massive open-source networks, weaponizing the innocent heritage searches of millions against the murderer. They tracked down distant cousins carrying fragments of the exact same biological blueprint. Experts meticulously constructed sprawling lineage webs woven from old press clippings, government registries, population counts, and buried paper trails. This grueling, obsessive search pointed directly toward William Charles Kernan Jr., a man casually referred to as Bill. Back then, he was merely a university scholar haunting the very same building where the young victim spent her final moments. The suspect knew the exact tenant who hired the girl and had frequently walked those specific hallways. Detectives confirmed the man possessed both the perfect opening and unimpeded entry. The precise psychological trigger remained hidden in shadows, written off as an act of pure, dark convenience. Yet, putting the monster behind bars was no longer an option. The coward had expired back in 2010, reduced to ash years before police finally learned his sinister secret. Devoid of surviving bloodlines to verify the link and lacking a corpse to dig out of the earth. Authorities officially closed the books, citing the perpetrator's journey to the grave. Though cheated out of a courtroom reckoning, the revelation offered the shattered family their first breath of peace in half a century, prompting local authorities to speak out. The department recognized the excruciatingly agonizing 47-year void endured by those who loved the fallen teenager. Officials stood proud, validating a victory born from relentless modern science and cutting-edge ancestral mapping. Relatives stepped before the cameras, breathing out a profound sigh of comfort at unmasking the phantom, even knowing their tormentor would forever escape any mortal punishment. Our next grim tale likewise demanded decades of silence before the science could snare its monster. The horrific fate of Carmen Van Hus. On the 23rd of March, 1993, the lifeless shell of 19-year-old Carmen Hope Van Hus lay punctured by a blade inside her Indianapolis residence. It was her own father who stumbled upon the nightmare 24 hours later, merely trying to see if she was safe. The room screamed of a desperate fight for survival, shattered belongings and discarded garments violently tossed across the floor. A crimson pool crept outward from where her body lay. The apartment entrance stood slightly open, yet crime scene technicians uncovered absolutely zero signs of a break-in. A tenant occupying the unit directly beneath the victim's residence handed detectives a chilling puzzle piece. This neighbor recalled being awakened by deeply unsettling noises during the previous evening. The horrific symphony included weeping, terrified shrieks, and violent crashes that echoed relentlessly for roughly half an hour. Heavy, aggressive male tones bled through the ceiling, alongside the victim's desperate begs for mercy, demanding her attacker just walk away. Yet, in a tragic twist of bystander apathy, nobody ever dialed 911. The silence lingered until the victim's own father made the gruesome discovery 24 hours later. Law enforcement meticulously scoured the entire housing complex, interrogating locals while technicians bagged trace forensics from the blood-soaked floors. Investigators mapped the violent spatter trajectories, secured critical biological samples, and painstakingly pieced together the harrowing chronology of her last moments alive. Police interrogated acquaintances, surrounding tenants, and any passing shadow who could offer even the slightest whisper of a clue. Yet the trail vanished into thin air, leaving detectives grasping at shadows. For 3 agonizing decades, 31 long years, the horrific murder gathered dust. Relatives endured an inescapable psychological torment, haunted by the phantom who had stolen their beloved daughter. Once a bright university scholar brimming with potential, her brutal elimination carved an unfillable chasm into the hearts of everyone left behind. The ice finally cracked in 2018. Detectives handed over residual biological material to Parabon NanoLabs, unleashing the power of cutting-edge ancestral mapping. Experts funneled the killer's biological blueprint into open-source heritage networks, slowly weaving together an intricate web of distant relatives. That meticulous unraveling demanded multiple years of exhausting, microscopic digital detective work. The net finally tightened in 2023 when authorities pinpointed 52-year-old Dana Jermaine Shepherd as their prime target. A swift background check unearthed a terrifying truth that original investigators had somehow completely missed. The suspect actually resided right next door. His complex physically linked to the victims through a common basement washroom. This lethal predator was practically sharing her breathing space, offering him an invisible, effortless pathway directly to her doorstep. During the summer of 2024, police finally secured the legal authorization to forcibly extract his genetic material. Lab results came back a definitive match, locking in the grim reality those ancestral trees had already whispered. Apprehended in Missouri that August, he now stares down a century-long sentence behind concrete walls. Bystanders watched the suspect physically tremble as badges flashed the court order. Clamping his mouth shut, he instantly invoked his right to counsel. By the autumn of 2024, he sat rotting in a holding cell, anticipating a forced transport back to Indiana jurisdiction. Addressing the press, the victim's brother Jimmy shared profound relief that the nightmare was finally drawing to a close. He mourned the stolen milestones, the missing cap and gown, the vanished white dress, and the countless souls who wept for her absence across the eras. Those heavy statements perfectly encapsulated the devastating, lingering fallout of such senseless butchery. Though justice required 30 years to materialize here, our next horrific puzzle presents an entirely distinct labyrinth of shadows. Enter Marianne Votstra. Dawn broke on the 1st of May, 1999, revealing the lifeless remains of a 16-year-old girl. She lay abandoned in a desolate pasture bordering the quiet Dutch settlement of Veenklooster. The teenager had simply been pedaling her bike through the dark, returning from a local gathering the night prior. Searchers stumbled upon the grisly scene hidden within the agricultural expanse, just inches from her expected path. This slaughter shattered the region's peaceful illusion, igniting what stands as arguably the most polarizing criminal pursuit in modern European history. Early detectives scrambled to bag genetic debris from the soil, while relentlessly questioning anyone within a 10-mile radius. Yet, despite that frantic initial sweep, the phantom killer slipped right through their fingers. Paranoia quickly poisoned the narrative, directing blind fury toward a local encampment of foreign refugees. Outrage boiled over into absolute chaos, sparking violent street clashes and targeted hostility against innocent immigrant populations. That mob mentality exposed a deep-seated bias, the desperate belief that the monster had to be a stranger. In truth, the butcher was hiding in plain sight. Countless seasons passed with zero traction, even as the government poured massive financial backing into unmasking her executioner. The biological footprint pulled from the dirt triggered no alarms in national systems, rendering old-school police work entirely useless. Her tragedy quickly became a dark symbol of where late 90s scientific capabilities ultimately hit a brick wall. This paralysis persisted even while laboratory genetics underwent a massive global evolution. Finally, in 2012, desperate officials pushed a highly debated, extreme legal maneuver. They launched an unprecedented genetic sweep, requesting cheek swabs from countless local males to forcefully flush out the predator. This massive, unprecedented sweep demanded genetic material from the local male population, zeroing in exclusively on those haunting the vicinity the night Marianne took her final breath. Such a sweeping genetic dragnet immediately triggered fierce debates, pulling back the curtain on profound moral and privacy anxieties. It forced a chilling question: where does hunting a killer end and violating civil liberties begin? Ultimately, the genetic web ensnared a familial anomaly, pointing detectives directly toward Jasper Staringa, an unassuming farmer woven into the very fabric of the community. He was no phantom drifter or mysterious transient. The perpetrator was a familiar shadow hiding in plain sight the entire time. Cornered by his own biology, Staringa made a sudden pivot that left veteran investigators utterly blindsided. Instead of dragging his blood relatives through a grueling, highly publicized media circus, he finally broke, confessing to his dark role in Marianne's demise. His stated motive was surprisingly domestic, shielding his loved ones from the agonizing glare of an endless judicial nightmare. Every chilling syllable he uttered perfectly mirrored the grim forensic tableau detectives had meticulously preserved from the crime scene. The dark truth emerged. The fatal strike was born entirely out of sudden, overwhelming panic. The attack was purely opportunistic, entirely lacking any cold, premeditated design. The court struck back hard, handing him a massive stretch behind concrete and steel. Closing this dark chapter forced the Netherlands into a fierce reckoning regarding genetic surveillance, individual privacy, and cutting-edge forensics. This nightmare permanently rewrote the rules of Dutch criminology, directly shaping future laws surrounding biological data harvesting and profiling. Furthermore, it stands as a chilling monument to the profound peril of letting community prejudice outpace hard, undeniable science. The conviction finally handed her shattered relatives concrete answers after 13 agonizing, haunting years. Still, no earthly verdict could ever truly reverse their devastating, permanent loss. Our descent into darkness continues with the Angie Dodge tragedy, a haunting chronicle scarred by a deeply twisted, wrongful conviction. On the 13th of June, 1996, 18-year-old Angie Dodge was discovered butchered inside her Idaho Falls residence. The gruesome discovery utterly shattered her quiet community. It ignited a relentless, two-decade manhunt, a chaotic labyrinth defined by a catastrophic legal failure before the real monster surfaced. This nightmare perfectly exposed the dangerous, glaring cracks hiding within old-school detective work. Conversely, it proved how correctly wielded genetic science holds a miraculous power to finally redeem. Early forensic sweeps secured organic trace elements, microscopic ghosts that would patiently wait years to unmask the true butcher. Yet, original detectives developed tunnel vision, inexplicably locking their crosshairs onto Christopher Tapp. He was a total stranger to the victim, violently dragged into the narrative by deeply manipulative, coercive police interviews. Crumbled by relentless psychological warfare, he parroted a fabricated confession, damning both himself and phantoms, knowing absolutely nothing. His coerced tale was a chaotic mess, completely clashing with the apartment's physical evidence. Blind to reason, the state pushed forward. Tapp was wrongfully condemned, handed 30 agonizing years in a concrete cage. 2 decades of his youth rotted away in a cell, while the real phantom roamed the streets without a scratch. He never stopped proclaiming his innocence, eventually rallying relentless legal crusaders to his side. They ruthlessly dismantled the grotesque, hollow foundation of the state's case. The biological footprint left behind unequivocally excluded him, a glaring neon sign the prosecution conveniently buried under courtroom theatrics. Future experts dissecting those dusty trial files were left utterly speechless. The deliberate erasure of such glaring, exculpatory science baffled them completely. Consumed by grief, The victim's mother, Carol Dodge, transformed into an unstoppable force hunting for the real predator. While society comfortably locked the cell door on an innocent man, she stared at the genetics, knowing the real monster breathed free air. She aggressively demanded fresh forensic probes, entirely rejecting a hollow conviction when the blood clearly whispered another man's name. Fighting against a stubborn police force eager to keep the file shut, her sheer, unbreakable willpower was absolutely staggering. That mother's burning fury became the singular catalyst that shattered the cold case and unshackled him. By 2017, ancestral DNA profiling erupted onto the forensic scene, slicing through the darkness of high-profile, dead-end mysteries. Investigators quietly cast the phantom's genetic sequence into massive, open-source ancestry databases. Digital genealogists began meticulously reverse-engineering bloodlines to finally unmask their elusive, unnamed ghost. This hunt brought detectives face-to-face with Brian Lee Dripps Sr. Chillingly, the predator had simply been the girl next door's neighbor, lurking within her very own apartment building when the slaughter occurred. The geographic reality of the situation sent a shiver down investigators' spines. The monster had been lurking right next door the entire time. Detectives actually spoke with Brian Dripps during their initial sweep, ultimately dismissing him entirely, dangerously blind to the predator, living mere feet from their victim. He was simply the quiet guy from across the street, a familiar face she would pass in the dimly lit corridors of their shared apartment complex. That terrifying proximity handed him the perfect window to strike. Finally backed into a corner by undeniable genetic proof in 2019, the facade crumbled, and he confessed to the slaying, feeding detectives granular crime scene facts only the true killer could possibly know. His grim narrative painted a picture of a predatory ambush meant to be an assault, spiraling into absolute carnage when she bravely fought back. Unmasking the real phantom immediately triggered a frantic legal scramble to liberate the man suffering in his place. That same year, the system finally cleared Tapp's name, unchaining him after 2 agonizing decades locked away for a nightmare he never authored. His stolen youth morphed into a dark, glaring testament against the psychological manipulation used in police interview rooms, highlighting the critical necessity of letting science speak louder than coerced admissions. Scholars now dissect the tragedy as a textbook manifestation of tunnel vision, where desperate authorities hammered square pegs into round holes, twisting the facts to suit their preferred narrative instead of letting the truth guide them. The actual architect of the crime faced swift justice, eventually submitting a formal plea, admitting to the horrific butchery. A judge handed down a crushing period of incarceration, ensuring the perpetrator would spend the twilight of his life rotting in a prison cell. Closing the file did not bring neat, cinematic peace, but rather a profoundly messy emotional fallout for everyone left in its wake. Even as her family absorbed the chilling reality of who truly stole her life, tentatively reaching for a fragile peace, they were forced to swallow the bitter pill that a blameless teenager was caged for 20 years while a killer walked free in the sunlight. The grieving mother publicly weighed the heavy duality of finally securing justice alongside her immense sorrow for the scapegoat's destroyed adulthood. This staggering miscarriage of justice ignited fierce, nationwide debate regarding the fragility of the American legal apparatus. It cast a harsh, unforgiving spotlight on the psychological warfare employed by detectives, demanding a radical overhaul of how interrogations are conducted behind closed doors. Academies and universities elevated the tragedy to mandatory curriculum, a grim warning of the catastrophic collateral damage born of confirmation bias. Cornered by undeniable reality, the local precinct finally stepped forward to publicly own their devastating procedural failures. Such an unprecedented show of institutional vulnerability served to vindicate those who had spent years screaming into the void about police misconduct. Meanwhile, the silent witness of genetic material was quietly bridging the gap between isolated atrocities, spotlighting a completely distinct nightmare surrounding a young woman named Kathy Halley. On the 20th of March, 1979, the 19-year-old simply evaporated into thin air right after clocking out from a retail shift in a sleepy Midwestern town. Her final known steps took her toward the evening transit line, a mundane journey toward the safety of her front door that she would violently never complete. The sudden, deafening silence from her end sent immediate shockwaves of terror through her tight-knit household. She operated like clockwork. For someone so fiercely dependable, this sudden vanishing act screamed that something sinister had intervened. Mere days later, searchers stumbled upon her discarded remains deep within a desolate patch of timber, extinguishing any desperate prayers for a safe return. The autopsy sketched a brutal, gruesome narrative, confirming she had suffered unimaginably at the hands of a ruthless predator. Crime scene technicians carefully locked away biological fragments harvested from her garments, hoping their rudimentary preservation tactics might someday hold the key. Detectives relentlessly interrogated locals and chased down spectral tips, yet the phantom responsible continuously slipped through their desperate grasp. The trail ultimately froze solid, consigning the tragedy to a dusty archive of unsolved 70s murders that quietly tormented the badge wearers and devastated the surviving kin. Those silent biological clues sat entombed in property lockup for nearly half a century, waiting in the dark as scientific capabilities steadily caught up to the crime. The turning point arrived in 2024, when a fresh set of eyes elected to run the antiquated evidence through cutting-edge forensic machinery. Utilizing a highly advanced fluid suction technique, scientists managed to lift microscopic biological ghosts directly from the fabric she wore that night. This groundbreaking approach bypassed the decay of time, successfully isolating the distinct genetic blueprint of an unknown male aggressor. Uploading the sequence into national criminal registries was akin to turning on a blacklight in a dark room. It instantly lit up a terrifying, unexpected connection. The molecular fingerprint pointed directly to Bruce Lindahl, an identity already steeped in blood within Midwestern detective bureaus. He was a prolific apex predator, a man implicitly tied to a horrific string of brutalized women across the urban sprawl during the late 1970s and early 1980s. His pathology had aggressively deepened over the years, morphing from violent attacks to outright slaughter, casting a paralyzing shadow over the entire state. Yet the madman's reign of terror did not conclude in a courtroom. It culminated in a uniquely poetic, violent twist of fate. In 1981, he ambushed the wrong target, bleeding to death after his prey fiercely turned the tables during the assault. That chaotic struggle proved fatally decisive, permanently neutralizing the serial killer right there on the floor. His abrupt demise effectively slammed the door on any direct confessions, burying the true, unfathomable scope of his hunting grounds. While detectives strongly suspected him of broader atrocities, the primitive science of the era simply could not bind the ghost to his numerous other victims. 4 agonizing decades after Lindahl drew his final breath, a definitive genetic match finally pierced the silence, delivering Kathy Halley's family the harrowing truth they had long sought. This grim biological link did more than map out Kathy's terrifying final moments. It cemented her tragedy as a crucial piece within Lindahl's sprawling, predatory campaign against vulnerable women. North Aurora investigators formally declared the mystery solved in 2024, acknowledging that while the monster himself would never face a judge, this undeniable forensic proof finally granted a measure of cold comfort to those who loved her most. The subsequent investigation delves into an utterly bizarre labyrinth of deception and desperation, the unsettling mystery surrounding Nicole Van den Hurk. As dawn broke on November 6, 1995, 15-year-old Nicole vanished without a trace while pedaling her bicycle from her Eindhoven residence in the Netherlands toward her grocery store shift. When her shift began without her and evening fell on an empty home, panic set in, prompting her terrified family to alert the authorities. Detectives soon discovered her lone bicycle discarded beside her usual commuting path, sparking a frantic, desperate manhunt to bring the teenager back alive. 2 agonizing months later, the search reached a grim conclusion when her violated remains were unearthed deep within a desolate, wooded expanse. Crime scene technicians meticulously scoured the unforgiving earth where Nicole had been discarded, gathering whatever microscopic clues the killer had carelessly left behind. Yet, unmasking the phantom responsible for such brutality proved to be an excruciatingly complex puzzle. Biological traces were secured, though the forensic science of 1995 was painfully primitive compared to the genetic wizardry that would define future eras. The trail rapidly froze. Detectives burned through every conceivable lead, only to find themselves staring at a blank wall, devoid of any legitimate suspects. For years, Nicole's relatives were condemned to a psychological purgatory, tortured by the unknown shadows of her final moments and the faceless predator who stole her future. Then, 2005 brought a profoundly disturbing psychological twist that would inadvertently break the stalemate. Nicole's own stepbrother, Andy, suddenly confessed to the atrocity. This jaw-dropping admission sent shockwaves through the precinct and utterly shattered the already fragile remnants of their grieving household. Yet, as detectives dug deeper into his narrative, the confession reeked of calculated manipulation rather than genuine, blood-stained guilt. Andy ultimately revealed a perilous gambit. He had falsely implicated himself solely to corner the legal system into reopening the vault and retesting the decaying forensic evidence. He harbored a desperate, unwavering conviction that modern genetic sequencing would expose the true monster, provided investigators applied contemporary science to the forgotten traces. The justice system took his bait, dragging Andy into court to face the very charges he had fabricated against himself. However, the prosecution found themselves legally paralyzed. Absolutely no physical residue tied the stepbrother to the brutal reality of the crime scene. Behind the scenes, his drastic gamble paid off, compelling officials to subject Nicole's tragic remnants to a modern forensic microscope. This grim undertaking required disturbing her final rest, exhuming the teenager to extract microscopic truths hidden deep within the bone. The probabilistic genotyping algorithms born in the early 2000s possessed the sheer analytical power to decipher degraded, chaotic genetic mixtures that previously baffled science. The resulting genetic profile completely exonerated Andy, shining a harsh, unavoidable spotlight on an entirely unexpected phantom hiding in the dark. The scientific finger pointed directly at Joste G, an individual burdened with a severely disturbed psychiatric past and a chilling record of prior offenses. Detectives meticulously retraced his steps, confirming the predator was prowling the exact same shadows where the innocent teenager was swallowed by the unknown. Piece by meticulous piece, the forensic evidence forged an inescapable iron cage, solidifying his identity as the true architect of Nicole's demise. The stepbrother's desperate lie was legally unraveled, resulting in his complete exoneration from the crushing weight of a murder he never committed. His reckless, sacrificial play to resurrect the investigation succeeded brilliantly, though he paid a devastating psychological price for standing trial as a fabricated monster. Joste G was dragged into the light, facing justice and a subsequent conviction for his heinous acts in 2014. Almost 2 agonizing decades after extinguishing her light, he was handed a massive prison term and rots behind bars today. Should this dark descent into the criminal abyss hold your attention? Ensure you follow our ongoing investigations and activate notifications for future chilling revelations. Our next descent explores the youngest casualty on record, Ann Pham, and a phantom predator hiding comfortably in plain sight. On the chilling morning of January 8, 1982, 5-year-old Ann vanished like vapor while making the short trek to her kindergarten class in Seaside, California. The innocent child had bounded out her front door toward elementary school, treading a familiar path she had navigated safely countless times prior. When the morning bell rang to an empty seat, alarmed educators instantly alerted her parents, igniting a desperate, adrenaline-fueled neighborhood manhunt. The tight-knit coastal town rallied as one to scour the streets. Tragically, mere days later, her tiny frame was uncovered in damp, wooded brush, uncomfortably close to home. Unearthing such pure innocence shattered the coastal enclave's sense of security, triggering a relentless criminal hunt destined to drag on for 40 agonizing years. Crime scene units cataloged the gruesome aftermath, relying heavily on the rudimentary, almost archaic forensic protocols of the early 1980s. Despite relentless police pressure, the trail froze. However, investigators meticulously safeguarded the physical remnants of Ann's tragedy across the generations. Buried within those dusty evidence boxes lay a single, microscopic strand of hair, a silent witness pulled directly from the killing ground. For generations, this isolated fiber was deemed virtually useless. Missing its biological root, orthodox extraction procedures simply could not decode its genetic secrets. Time marched forward, and alongside it, the relentless evolution of biological sciences birthed revolutionary, microscopic analytical weapons. By 2022, cold case detectives handed this forgotten strand to an elite facility armed with bleeding-edge technology, capable of ripping a killer's identity from a completely rootless hair. The laboratory extracted a flawless genetic blueprint from the fading evidence. This biological signature was then quietly fed into sprawling ancestral databases. The digital web ultimately ensnared Robert John Lanou, a man who had been residing just streets away when the little girl vanished into thin air. Positioned uncomfortably close, he possessed the perfect vantage point to silently study her daily movements. The suspect was a former military man who had quietly woven himself into the fabric of the seaside community. Confronted with the undeniable science, the facade crumbled, and he confessed to a dark, deep-seated compulsion for targeting defenseless children. His chilling admission unveiled a predatory timeline predating this tragedy, strongly hinting that this particular child was merely one name on a much longer list. For decades, he had masterfully played the role of a harmless citizen, burying the horrific truth of his actions beneath a veneer of absolute normalcy. He forged friendships, punched the clock at work, and flawlessly mimicked the rhythms of an everyday, law-abiding life. The unmasking of this phantom devastated the community that had unwittingly harbored a monster. He was ultimately indicted for the atrocity, bracing for the relentless weight of justice inside a Monterey County courtroom. By 2024, the gavel fell on a life sentence, permanently neutralizing his ability to hunt another innocent soul. He is condemned to draw his final, miserable breaths confined within the concrete walls of a maximum security cell. For the shattered relatives left behind, this closure delivered an agonizing cocktail of long-awaited vindication and entirely resurrected trauma. At long last, they possessed the identity of the phantom, who ensured their child never reached her kindergarten classroom on that freezing January dawn. 4 decades of suffocating uncertainty had finally been pierced by the cold, irrefutable precision of modern forensic technology. Yet, while that nightmare was orchestrated by the man next door, our next harrowing chapter uncovers a predator hiding behind a sworn oath, the tragic execution of Sherry Rasmussen. On February 24, 1986, the lifeless body of a 29-year-old woman was discovered brutalized inside her quiet Van Nuys residence. Her spouse stumbled upon the macabre scene after a routine workday, finding the brilliant, highly respected nursing director dead. She had just embarked on a new chapter of life, having recently exchanged vows with John Ruetten. The blood-stained condominium echoed the chaotic remnants of a desperate, terrifyingly intimate struggle for survival. Early detectives built a comfortable narrative, a botched robbery where the homeowner fatally interrupted a crew of desperate thieves. Among the scattered clues was a distinct bite mark on the victim's forearm, a deeply visceral signature that would lie dormant until science caught up with the killer. The Los Angeles Police Department doubled down on the botched break-in hypothesis, letting tunnel vision dictate their every move. Glaring inconsistencies were ignored. Highly valuable electronics and heirlooms sat entirely undisturbed amid the staged wreckage. Furthermore, the sheer savagery of the attack betrayed a deep-seated rage that far exceeded the panic strikes of a petty thief. The grieving husband nervously flagged his ex-lover, an active-duty LAPD detective named Stephanie Lazarus, whose obsessive jealousy over the marriage had been palpable. This scorned officer had crossed the line before, directly threatening the newlywed in a deeply unsettling face-to-face altercation. Yet, the blue wall of silence seemingly descended. Detectives inexplicably brushed past this glaring red flag, protecting one of their own. The horrifying implication that a badge-wearing guardian could execute such a bloodbath was simply too much for the department to swallow. Predictably, the phantom burglar theory yielded 0 suspects, plunging the deeply compromised investigation into the freezing depths of the cold. The handful of missing trinkets never surfaced on the black market, and the handcuffs remained firmly locked in their pouches. The murder binder was quietly boxed away to gather dust, becoming just another anonymous ghost story in the sprawling, blood-soaked archives of Los Angeles. For more than 20 agonizing years, the horrific truth remained buried inside a cardboard box in a forgotten evidence room. But the victim's family flatly refused the official lie, absolutely convinced the home invasion narrative was a conveniently fabricated smokescreen. They inherently knew the executioner possessed an intimate, twisted connection to either the young bride or her husband. They relentlessly hounded the department, desperately trying to force authorities to strip away the dust and reevaluate the bloody facts. Their primary demand was a merciless magnifying glass placed directly onto the jealous detective who had been so easily dismissed decades prior. Tragically, their impassioned pleas fell on deaf ears, patronized and brushed aside by investigators, desperately clinging to the status quo. There was an unspoken, systemic terror at the prospect of exposing a decorated colleague as a cold-blooded butcher. This gross institutional paralysis and blatant fraternal protection would inevitably detonate into a catastrophic, career-ending scandal. The monumental fracture in the case finally arrived in 2008, when a fresh set of eyes ordered a genetic sweep of the long-forgotten bite mark. Extracted from biological material miraculously preserved in the freezer, the lab results unveiled a chillingly unexpected truth. The killer was a woman. In a single scientific stroke, the decades-old myth of male intruders was absolutely decimated, exposing the fatal flaws in the original police work. The invisible sequence was instantly routed through federal databanks, silently hunting for a match that would change everything. The genetic profile pointed directly at Stephanie Lazarus, a veteran Los Angeles police detective who had spent over 2 decades hiding in plain sight following Sherry's brutal murder. This revelation sent shockwaves through the precinct. The monster they had been hunting for years had been wearing a badge all along. As investigators dug deeper into their colleague's past, a dark, twisted web of jealousy and fatal obsession began to surface. Long before John Ruetten took his wedding vows with his new bride, he shared a romantic history with Lazarus, a discarded connection. The bitter officer utterly refused to let go. Long after the couple tied the knot, those who knew the detective described an unyielding, stalker-like fixation that only seemed to intensify in the shadows. Her emotional response to their union was not just heartbreak, it was deeply terrifying and unhinged. Under the quiet guise of daylight, the armed officer cornered her rival inside her own sanctuary, transforming a tense standoff into a horrific, bloody fight for survival. Amidst that savage brawl, the killer left behind a crucial biological signature through a vicious bite, the very microscopic clue that would secure her downfall decades later. In 2009, an elaborate internal sting operation finally brought the rogue investigator into custody. The unmasking of a murderer within their own ranks rattled the Los Angeles Police Department and sent tremors across the nation's law enforcement fraternity. Discovering that a cold-blooded killer had investigated cases just desks away from them for nearly a quarter of a century sparked profound, chilling doubts. Scrutiny quickly fell upon the initial probe, leaving many to wonder if glaring evidence had been purposely buried by those protecting the blue line. Intense departmental audits sought to understand how a woman with such a lethal, glaringly obvious grudge had been so conveniently dismissed from the early suspect list. The wheels of justice finally turned in a high-stakes courtroom showdown during 2012. State attorneys painted a deeply disturbing portrait of romantic madness, backing their psychological narrative with absolutely undeniable genetic linkages. Legal representatives for the accused scrambled to cast doubt upon the forensic science, grasping at phantom suspects to blur the truth. Yet, the cold, hard, biological facts stood like an impenetrable wall, impossible to dismantle or deny. Chilling testimonies detailed the detective's increasingly erratic actions leading up to the slaughter, exposing a soul entirely corroded by venomous envy. The jury ultimately found her guilty of premeditated malice, handing down a crushing sentence of 27 years to life behind bars. Even after repeatedly facing rejection from the parole board, the disgraced officer stubbornly clings to a hollow facade of innocence against an avalanche of proof. This disturbing saga laid bare the catastrophic, almost negligent shortcomings of the initial homicide squad. It also cast a dark, lingering shadow over the ability of police departments to impartially investigate the sins of their own sworn protectors. For the grieving relatives left behind, the grim verdict finally validated decades of desperate, echoing suspicions. They always knew the botched robbery narrative was a convenient lie, masking the reality that the true predator lurked deep within their social circle. The agonizing weight of 23 years stemmed directly from an insidious, systemic refusal to turn the spotlight on a fellow badge wearer. That tragic delay was further compounded by the stark limitations of forensic profiling during the mid-1980s. Another haunting mystery would soon demonstrate the power of modern genetics to link seemingly isolated horrors, the tragic tale of Holly Ann Campiglia. The nightmare commenced on November 12, 1980, when a vibrant 21-year-old vanished without a single trace. She had just clocked out of her waitressing shift at a bustling retail center nestled in the heart of Fresno, California. As the evening fell, witnesses caught a fleeting glimpse of the young woman walking through the dimly lit asphalt lot, approaching her vehicle for the last time. Alarm bells rang quickly when she never arrived at her residence and missed her subsequent work rotation, prompting terrified loved ones to contact authorities. An exhaustive dragnet swept across the county, uniting desperate civilians and uniformed officers in a frantic hunt through every conceivable shadow. Several agonizing days passed before a gruesome discovery shattered their hopes. Her lifeless remains were discarded within a desolate, rural corn expanse miles from the city limits. Crime scene technicians meticulously scoured the grim agricultural site, extracting whatever silent clues the deceased had inadvertently left behind. Among these subtle hints were microscopic organic fluids, carefully stored away using the rather archaic preservation techniques of that era. Detectives interrogated countless persons of interest and chased down endless rabbit holes, yet their relentless pursuit yielded nothing but dead ends. As the trail inevitably froze over, the grieving relatives were condemned to suffer through decades of agonizing, unanswered questions regarding the unseen predator. Deep within police archives, those tiny, crucial biological fragments waited in the dark, biding their time while forensic science evolved at lightning speed. Through the suffocating passage of time, her resilient kin absolutely refused to let the spark of justice extinguish completely. Year after year, they relentlessly badgered the precinct, pleading with authorities to apply cutting-edge laboratory innovations to the dusty, forgotten files. It was solely this fierce, unyielding advocacy that prevented the tragic mystery from becoming just another permanent casualty of the filing cabinet. By the dawn of the early 2020s, their fierce determination finally paid off, compelling the authorities to route the old physical clues through next-generation genetic sequencers. This state-of-the-art biological extraction successfully isolated a pristine genomic signature, unlocking the ability to sweep through vast digital registries of incarcerated predators. The algorithm eventually pinged with a chillingly precise hit, illuminating the name of Herman Lee Hobbs. This phantom was already locked away behind bars for a string of horrific, violent felonies, opening the floodgates to an even darker, far-reaching web of terror. The man known as Hobbs was already sitting behind bars, serving time for a long, dark history of violence, a record that tragically included defenseless children. Like many predators, his depravity had grown bolder with the years, making young Holly one of his grim, foundational targets. Connecting the genetic dots in Holly's file triggered a massive forensic sweep, tying this phantom to a string of cold cases that plagued California throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. By the time prosecutors formally indicted him for Holly's fate in 2023, the killer was already buried under the weight of several consecutive life sentences. While he was already destined to die in a cage, this final legal nail guaranteed that he would never breathe free air again. For the grieving relatives left behind, putting a name to the monster finally offered a sliver of closure. It took 43 agonizing years of shadows and whispers before they uncovered the exact face of the man who stole their little girl. They could finally start to navigate their generational grief, anchored by the cold comfort that her destroyer was rotting in a cell forever. This breakthrough served as a chilling testament to the power of modern genetic registries in waking dead files from their slumber. It proved that microscopic biological traces, patiently waiting in evidence lockers, could unmask repeat offenders long thought to be ghosts. The evidence painted a terrifying psychological portrait of a hunter whose violent urges only sharpened and intensified as the decades bled on, proving that the earliest, most mysterious atrocities often stay buried until a much later, careless mistake finally surrenders the killer's biological signature. Yet another investigation would soon unearth a deeply unsettling link to a notorious string of horrors, the tragic end of Lori Ann Powell. Deep in the quiet woods, shadowing Virginia's Colonial Parkway, the lifeless body of 18-year-old Lori Ann was discovered on the 9th of August, 1988. The teenager, affectionately known as Lori, had endured a savage frenzy of blade wounds, leaving behind a grim tableau of a desperate, agonizing struggle. Where she was discarded sent an immediate, icy chill down the spines of the seasoned detectives working the region. Throughout the 1980s, that seemingly picturesque stretch of the Colonial Parkway had transformed into a notorious hunting ground for the missing and the dead. To the trained eyes of law enforcement, Lori's brutal demise slotted perfectly into a deeply sinister, escalating sequence. Forensics swept the eerie crime scene, meticulously gathering and freezing biological anomalies, silent witnesses waiting for the future to unlock their secrets. Investigators frantically interrogated anyone who crossed her path in those final days, chasing down every bizarre theory and shadowy rumor attempting to explain her doom. But despite the relentless manhunt and sleepless nights, the killer remained a phantom slipping through their fingers. Her file was tossed onto the mounting pile of the Colonial Parkway enigmas, a dark, open wound that would torment detectives for decades to come. For generations of badge-carrying officers, the Parkway mystery stood as a monument to their most agonizing, unsolvable failures. In a startlingly brief window of time, this beautiful, winding road had swallowed several young, innocent lives whole. It fueled rampant, terrifying whispers across the community that a singular, calculating predator was stalking the blacktop. Yet, the tangible threads needed to tie these tragedies together remained maddeningly invisible, forcing isolated task forces to work blindly in their own silos. Then, in the year 2025, a seismic crack finally formed in the foundation of the cold case. Cutting-edge forensic technology breathed life into Lori's decades-old genetic evidence, cross-referencing the killer's ghost against sprawling, modern genealogical networks. The silent code pointed the finger directly at Alan W. Wilmer, Sr., a local man harboring the deceptively harmless nickname of Pokey. A rugged Virginia fisherman and lumberjack, he had taken his dark secrets to the grave in 2017, outrunning justice by 8 long years. Digging deeper into the dead man's past unearthed a labyrinth of even more horrific, deeply buried ties. His biological signature did not stop at Lori. It rippled outward, chemically chaining him to other atrocities. The science unequivocally tethered him to the slaughter of 3 more young women who perished during the blood-soaked late 1980s in Virginia. It painted a horrifying picture. A prolific, highly organized serial predator hiding in plain sight, casually accumulating a body count while laughing at the law. The geography and the grisly timeline of his known butcheries dovetailed seamlessly with the overarching nightmare. It perfectly mapped onto the macabre blueprint of the infamous Colonial Parkway slayings. Since the grave had claimed him in 2017, the criminal justice system was robbed of its chance to make him face a jury of his peers. Still, putting a definitive face to the phantom offered a bitter, essential truth to the families who had spent lifetimes drowning in the unknown. By November 2025, Virginia's top prosecutors broadcasted the revelation to the world, grimly noting that the hunt for more bodies was far from over. Detectives began tearing through archives of the era's forgotten victims, hunting for any trace that Wilmer's shadow had fallen over other lost souls. Unmasking the Bogeyman delivered a highly toxic, complex cocktail of relief and lingering fury for the loved ones of Lori and the other girls. The heavy, suffocating question of who tore their worlds apart had finally been answered. Yet the cold reality of his passing meant the monster would never sit in a courtroom and face the damning eyes of the survivors. He had successfully escaped the stinging humiliation and absolute ruin of a public reckoning. As the dust settled, another file was cracked open, the enigma of Deborah Lee Miller, a case destined to climax in a totally unforeseen, explosive collision. The spring morning of March 25, 1981, brought a chilling discovery. 18-year-old Deborah Lee Miller lay dead inside her Mansfield, Ohio residence. The blood-soaked apartment bore the horrific signatures of a prolonged, merciless struggle involving severe physical trauma and alternative brutal methods. Her residence sat within a crowded, multi-level apartment complex. Detectives immediately descended upon the complex, aggressively securing forensic clues from the gruesome scene and interrogating surrounding residents. One such resident pulled aside for questioning was James Van Hus, a man occupying a unit directly above the slaughter. During his interrogation, the upstairs neighbor calmly constructed an alibi, detailing exactly where he was during the agonizing hours. Time would expose his narrative as a calculated lie, yet the authorities simply lacked the hard proof to shatter it then. Paralyzed by circumstantial gaps, detectives possessed no legal ammunition to pierce his alibi or bind him to the teenager's demise. Days bled into agonizing years, and the investigation slowly decayed into a frozen file as promising avenues entirely evaporated. Yet, physical remnants of the struggle, most crucially, the hidden cellular traces left behind, were meticulously sealed away in the evidence vault. These grim biological fragments contained intertwined genetic signatures, a biological puzzle that the primitive forensic science of 1981 could not untangle. Genetic profiling remained a distant, futuristic concept, entirely lacking the intricate procedures required to successfully decode merged biological traces. For decades, the biological clues lay dormant in a cold locker, silently waiting for an era when science could make them speak. Fast forward to 2024. Cold case detectives subjected these ancient remnants to cutting-edge algorithms specifically designed to isolate hidden genetic contributors. The laboratory breakthrough was absolute, successfully isolating a distinct masculine genetic signature primed to be run through national criminal registries. The digital dragnet returned a chilling, undeniable hit. The ghost profile belonged to James Van Hus. This was the very same man from the upstairs unit who smoothly answered police inquiries over 4 decades prior. Wielding this newfound scientific certainty, authorities tracked down the aging suspect in 2021 decades, removed from the initial encounter demanding answers. The suspect desperately spun fresh lies to excuse his genetic presence, but his frantic excuses wildly contradicted his original 1981 testimony. Armed with the finalized laboratory confirmation in 2024, detectives once again moved in to confront the elusive neighbor. The target completely stonewalled the inquiry, choosing absolute icy silence over answering for the ghosts of his past. Digging deeper into the suspect's shadow, a distinctly dark, sociopathic portrait began to take shape. His lengthy rap sheet was painted with violent prior offenses, legally stripping him of the right to carry firearms as a convicted felon. Yet the law meant nothing to him throughout his illicit life. Consequently, authorities readied the paperwork to finally shackle him for the teenager's slaughter. But the arc of justice violently fractured into an unforeseen direction during the bleak autumn month of November 2024. The suspect met a grisly end during a chaotic standoff, with law enforcement officers executing an entirely separate felony warrant. What began as a routine tactical apprehension for unassociated crimes rapidly spiraled into a deadly barrage of bullets that permanently silenced the killer. That fatal shootout guaranteed the predator would never see the inside of a courtroom to answer for the horrors inflicted upon Deborah. In the waning, bitter months of 2024, authorities formally declared the decades-old murder mystery officially closed. Officials publicly confirmed that undeniable genetic proof had successfully unmasked the dead neighbor as the architect of the 43-year-old atrocity. Although the scientific breakthrough finally offered tragic closure to the victim's grieving relatives, the perpetrator's violent demise robbed the justice system of its chance to formally prosecute his monstrous act. Consequently, the investigation was classified as exceptionally cleared, concluded solely by the grim reality of the murderer's permanent absence. This next harrowing narrative represents one of the most agonizing chronological voids ever recorded between a horrific act and an eventual capture. The tragedy of Dawn Mamara commenced during the sweltering, unforgiving heat of July 26, 1977. The 16-year-old McKinley High School student vanished like a ghost after simply walking out the front door of her family residence in Honolulu, Hawaii. Beloved by faculty and peers alike, her sudden absence that night sent shockwaves through her household, sparking a desperate, sweeping manhunt across the island's capital. Several sunrises later, searchers stumbled upon her discarded remains in a desolate area, a haunting tableau confirming she met a savage end. The initial, desperate investigative dragnet cast in 1977 saw detectives interrogating a vast array of potential witnesses. Detectives meticulously pulled in the teenager's closest confidants, fellow students, and anyone drifting through her social orbit. Every single soul who could have potentially spotted the girl during her final living hours was relentlessly questioned. Crime scene technicians painstakingly harvested clues from the bleak dumping ground, notably securing her garments, which were stained with foreign organic matter. Woven deeply into the massive tapestry of suspects was Gideon Castro, a fellow pupil navigating the very same high school halls. The young man casually offered his version of events to the authorities, smoothly navigating the inquiry and walking away entirely unscathed. With no concrete threads to legally anchor a predator to the senseless slaughter, the pursuit of justice inevitably froze into a dormant file. The horrific crime had simply outpaced the era's science, effectively masked by the severe limitations of late 1970s criminal profiling technology. Investigators meticulously archived the biological traces. Back then, the genetic science needed to unravel this grim puzzle remained a distant dream in forensic methodology. Dawn's loved ones suffered through decades of agonizing silence, clinging to a fragile hope that future scientific breakthroughs would finally unearth the truth. The monumental turning point finally materialized in 2020. Aided by federal agents, cold case detectives finally subjected those long dormant biological samples to advanced genetic scrutiny. Hidden within the fabric of the victim's garments, forensic experts successfully extracted a distinct, undeniable male genetic signature. Run through national registries, the phantom profile struck a chilling chord pointing directly to Gideon Castro, an old peer questioned decades prior, in 1977. The statistical certainty of this connection was absolute, cementing an undeniable, damning link to the horrific crime. By 2020, when the net finally closed, the elusive suspect was quietly rotting away inside a Utah care facility. Time had ravaged his body. The once capable man was now crippled by severe paralysis and deteriorating mental faculties brought on by advanced age. Unmoved by his frail state, relentless Hawaiian law enforcement pushed forward, determined to hold him legally accountable for the ancient atrocity. By January 2025, handcuffs clicked on the aging suspect. He was formally indicted for the nightmare inflicted upon Dawn, nearly 50 years prior. Yet, the pursuit of justice fractured abruptly when state attorneys scrutinized the decaying physical proof and the grim reality of the timeline. By March 2025, the prosecution folded. The devastating passage of time had eroded material integrity and silenced crucial witnesses, forcing a bitter dismissal. State attorneys concluded they desperately required further inquiry to fortify the fragile evidentiary chain before risking a trial. Spared by his physical deterioration, the aging suspect slipped from the law's grasp, retreating back to the quiet confines of his nursing facility. Heading into the twilight of 2025, the chilling inquiry officially remained an active, breathing entity. Authorities made it known they were meticulously reevaluating the cold facts, searching for a robust legal pathway to resurrect the indictment. This procedural setback was not an exoneration. It merely signaled that profound chronological and forensic hurdles required untangling before justice could be served. This bizarre legal paralysis trapped the grieving relatives in an agonizing purgatory handed the name of a monster, only to watch him walk free. The tragic unraveling of Fawn Marie Cox. During the sweltering heat of July 26, 1989, law enforcement descended upon a quiet Kansas City home. Upstairs, within the suffocating confines of a second-story bedroom, lay the lifeless body of a vibrant youth. Born on March 24, 1973, Fawn was a dedicated teenager, quietly shouldering the burden of household finances with after-school employment. Between punching carnival tickets and maintaining a devout presence at her local congregation, her life was grounded and pure. Her relatives occupied a modest, two-level structure nestled within a neglected neighborhood, a place plagued by financial despair and lurking violence. The shadowy terror unfolded in the dead of night, while her oblivious relatives slumbered peacefully just one floor below. A phantom breached her sanctuary. The assailant utilized an adjacent trailer as a stepping stone to slip through an unsecured upper-level window. That fatal entry point had been propped open, a desperate attempt to catch a breeze against the oppressive, unconditioned summer swelter. The predator looted the premises, grabbing assorted electronics, a gaming system, audio equipment, leaving a careless, scattered trail of stolen goods in the yard. Left behind in the horrific aftermath was a single chilling clue, a mysterious military-style hat. Crime scene technicians meticulously harvested vital remnants from the blood-stained sanctuary, pulling crimson droplets, stray fibers, and microscopic traces directly from the linens. These dark fragments were carefully sealed away, utilizing the primitive archival techniques standard to the twilight of the 1980s. Genetic profiling was still in its infancy. Yet, those silent witnesses would sit dormant in an evidence locker for over 30 years, waiting for science to finally catch up. Early suspicions targeted a trio of neighborhood youths who freely admitted to burglarizing the property during that fatal time frame. While the boys sat behind bars for the robbery, modern microscopic analysis would ultimately prove they were phantoms in the murder itself. As the well of clues ran completely dry, the horrific inquiry plunged into a freezing stasis. The atrocity sent shockwaves through the local populace, haunting the seasoned detectives who simply could not shake the memory of the slaughtered girl. For 31 grueling years, her survivors were suffocated by a blanket of agonizing, unresolved silence. The massive tectonic shift finally arrived in November 2020, spearheaded by a formidable government strike force known as Operation Legend. This national task force armed municipal police with cutting-edge microscopic tools designed specifically to resurrect and conquer dead-end mysteries. The killer's genetic footprint, extracted from that ancient crime scene, was fed into the National Registry only to be met with a maddening, empty silence. Desperate, authorities shipped the molecular ghost to the elite genetic sleuths at Parabon NanoLabs. By bouncing the signature against vast, open-source ancestry webs, forensic scientists painstakingly constructed a sprawling map of the predator's lineage. This digital bloodline hunt eventually locked its crosshairs on a single, terrifying name, Donald Cox Jr. In a sickening twist, Donald was her own 21-year-old cousin. As a frequent guest, he possessed an intimate, deadly understanding of the home's exact layout. This intimate familiarity mapped out every vulnerable entryway, granting him the chilling opportunity to lie in wait before the strike. The grim reality soon surfaced. The architect of this nightmare was someone intimately trusted by the household. Detectives ultimately tracked down a biological sample from Donald Cox Jr., extracted during a 2006 inquiry regarding his sudden passing from an apparent overdose. Pitted against the preserved forensic traces from 1989, the genetic alignment was absolutely undeniable. Yet, securing traditional courtroom justice remained an absolute impossibility as Cox perished in 2006, 2 full decades before his unmasking. Thus, authorities permanently sealed the file, logging it as an exceptional clearance. Fawn's devastated relatives finally received the harrowing call. Fawn's sister, Felicia, harbored deep resentment, convinced that immense wealth and societal influence would have compelled authorities to exhaust every resource much sooner to secure answers. Captain Ben Caldwell observed how deeply the tragedy fractured the local psyche, as Fawn was pure innocence, stolen from the sanctuary of her bedroom. Our ensuing narrative similarly unmasks a phantom killer who escaped earthly reckoning through death. On September 28, 1981, Portsmouth police breached a Chapel Street apartment only to find 23-year-old Laura Kempton lying lifeless in the silent, blood-stained room. She was a radiant cosmetology student navigating New Hampshire, holding down a modest job at a neighborhood boutique. Celebrated for her magnetic charm, untamed spirit, and striking avant-garde style, she remained a deeply cherished fixture within the local scene. As night fell on September 27th, she shared drinks and laughter with companions before making the solitary journey back home. Under the suffocating cover of darkness, an unseen predator violently breached her sanctuary. The Phantom launched a brutal violation before ultimately striking her with a heavy glass vessel, inflicting catastrophic, fatal cranial injuries. Detectives encountered a chilling tableau. Her battered remains lay concealed beneath a mattress, her ankles tightly bound by an electric blanket cord. Specialists meticulously harvested vital trace materials from the apartment. The haunting remnants featured seminal fluids, crimson spatters, latent prints, and a carelessly discarded cigarette butt. Safely archived, these fragments proved monumental decades later. The bloody stage hinted at a premeditated intrusion that spiraled into absolute savagery. The intense manhunt saw detectives vigorously interrogating her closest companions, nearby neighbors, and anyone who might have glimpsed a shadow out of place. Despite their relentless pursuit, the primitive forensic limitations of the early 1980s left authorities grasping at elusive, nameless ghosts. The trail eventually froze over, yet the file remained active. For 42 agonizing years, her loved ones navigated the suffocating void of a completely unsolved murder. The monumental breakthrough materialized in 2023 as revolutionary forensic genetic genealogy was unleashed upon the meticulously preserved crime scene samples. Identifinders International expertly analyzed the recovered genetic sequence, guiding the task force straight to Ronnie James Lee, a 21-year-old drifter at the time of the brutal slaying. Probing his background unearthed a deeply unsettling psychological portrait. He was a military veteran carrying a dark, thoroughly documented history of alarming, violent compulsions. By 1987, exactly 6 years following the slaughter, Lee faced convictions for violent home invasions and savage attacks in Keene. Lingering behind bars until 1990, his record strongly implied his predatory habits persisted long after silencing his initial victim. Yet, securing formal retribution in a courtroom was entirely impossible. Lee succumbed to severe narcotic toxicity in 2005, cheating the executioner 18 full years before his unmasking as the butcher. The state's highest prosecutor voiced a solemn hope that this long overdue revelation might bring the shattered family a fractured sense of peace. Her surviving kin commended the dogged persistence of law enforcement, a relentless crusade that finally pierced 40 years of profound silence. The grim case file was officially sealed as exceptionally cleared. The horrifying reality remains. This predator walked completely free for 24 years after extinguishing a brilliant young life, likely claiming other victims before dying in absolute impunity. As these chapters conclude unpunished, our next horror introduces entirely new investigative hurdles. On September 2nd, 1984, the lifeless shell of 24-year-old Deborah surfaced from the dark, icy waters of Narrow River in Narragansett, Rhode Island. Her decaying form was stuffed inside a sleeping bag, violently weighed down by a cinder block, a glaring testament to absolute, calculated malice. This grim unearthing triggered a sprawling manhunt, languishing for over 4 decades before finally producing concrete answers. While the twisted trail toward justice spiraled through baffling dead ends and shadowy corridors, detectives ultimately pinpointed her final known movements to the sinister apartment of Robert Garemia on August 29, 1984. In the days preceding the grim discovery of her remains, the victim had crossed paths with Garemia. He was a notorious local figure submerged in the underground narcotics trade, and Deborah had reportedly knocked on his door desperate for a fix. Shadows of their final encounter would eventually surface, detailing a volatile confrontation where he furiously accused her of skimming from his illicit stash. Detectives eventually caught a whisper from a confidential source, deeply embedded in the underworld. The informant revealed that the suspect had openly boasted about dealing with her permanently, demanding violent retribution for the perceived betrayal. This chilling dialogue strongly implied that he had executed her in cold blood over the missing contraband. Yet, translating those dark rumors into hard convictions proved virtually impossible given the primitive forensic science of the mid-1980s. Starved of physical proof, the investigation ultimately froze, leaving detectives completely unable to pin the homicide on their prime suspect. For decades, the case languished in the shadows, gathering dust in police archives. Meanwhile, her grieving loved ones were trapped in a purgatory of unanswered questions and elusive justice. The alleged killer, long feared in the local drug scene, took his final breath in 1995. He succumbed to natural causes just 11 years after the murder, and his passing seemingly buried any hope for accountability. It felt as though the dark secrets of what truly transpired near Narrow River had died with him. But the ghosts of the past refused to rest. Rhode Island authorities recently resurrected the file during an aggressive, statewide sweep of dormant homicides. The pivotal crack in the armor arrived in 2025, born from relentless witness follow-ups and the sharp edge of modern psychological profiling. Detectives tracked down 32 original contacts. Their memories, completely unshaken by time, painted a vivid, undeniable portrait of that fatal night. This renewed hunt also leveraged contemporary insights into deceptive behaviors and historical polygraph data. Armed with advanced psychological tactics, analysts tore through the old transcripts, finding hidden truths buried in the original interrogations. Approaching the dusty files with a modern investigative lens changed absolutely everything. By scientifically mapping behavioral consistency and testimony overlap, authorities forged an ironclad link between the dealer and the slain woman. This triumphant breakthrough occurred despite the prime suspect rotting in the ground for 30 years. Genetic testing was certainly sweeping through the state's other forgotten crimes during this era. However, this specific mystery was untangled not in a sterile lab, but through relentless detective work and the heavy weight of human memory. 4 decades of unwavering accounts from those who knew the truth became the ultimate weapon. Woven together with the snitch's chilling report of a killer's boast, this evidence formed the bedrock needed to finally seal the file. Narragansett Police Chief Kyle Rekas publicly addressed the grim triumph of finally naming the murderer. He grimly acknowledged the 40-year nightmare her relatives endured, hauntingly anchored to a life stolen far too soon. Officially labeling the mystery solved offered a fragile sliver of peace to those left behind. Yet, that relief was permanently poisoned by the reality that a murderer evaded earthly judgment by dying 3 decades too early. Authorities formally classified the homicide as exceptionally cleared, a bureaucratic finality necessitated by a deceased perpetrator. The terrifying reality finally dragged into the light was singular and absolute. A ruthless predator operating within the subterranean drug economy had callously snuffed out her existence. He executed her over petty contraband, walking free for 11 years before nature claimed him. It proved that a killer's grave cannot bury the truth forever. Even if a monster escapes handcuffs through death, modern tenacity can still extract the answers that desperate families bleed for. The subsequent mystery, however, features a predator who actually survived long enough to stare down his own reckoning. The tragic narrative of Pamela Sumter. Back in 1990, Stone Mountain, Georgia, became the epicenter of a frantic search when panicked relatives reported a young woman vanishing without a trace. Unraveling the threads of her vanishing act eventually exposed a terrifying double tragedy that engulfed both her and her sibling. These twin horrors festered as cold files for 30-plus years until genetic breakthroughs finally unmasked the phantom responsible, exposing a deeply disturbed past. The macabre fragments of her final hours bled into the public consciousness at a painfully slow crawl. Detectives were forced to painstakingly assemble a jigsaw puzzle of horror from the scattered debris of her life. Navigating the degraded biological evidence from that era presented an absolute nightmare for forensic specialists. For 34 agonizing years, her loved ones begged the universe for a name, a reason, and a villain to hold accountable. The pivotal crack in the ice occurred when revolutionary genetic genealogy finally caught up to the hidden monster. Scientists meticulously extracted viable profiles from a sexual assault kit that had been chilling in an evidence locker since the initial crime. By cross-referencing this ghostly signature with sprawling national databases, they wove a digital net that inevitably ensnared the killer. Merging old-school crime scene preservation with breakthrough DNA sequencing became the definitive key to unmasking the phantom. The dark trail ultimately stopped at Kenneth Perry. Tied to Detroit, this suspect carried a documented, deeply disturbing obsession with violence against women. A predatory nomad, he exploited state borders to cloak his monstrous compulsions, operating completely invisibly for decades. Digital ancestry mapping pinpointed innocent blood relatives who had unknowingly uploaded their biological blueprints online. Detectives methodically pruned this family tree, zeroing in on Perry as the undeniable match to Pamela's biological remnants. In a rare twist for decades-old mysteries, this particular monster was actually still drawing breath. Authorities finally linked his looming shadow to Pamela's brutal demise. Apprehended at last, he stared down justice for atrocities he committed over 30 years prior. The case was an ironclad fusion. Immaculately archived biological remnants paired seamlessly with modern genealogical profiling naming him. DeKalb County prosecutors watched an utterly hopeless phantom hunt suddenly materialize into a rock-solid indictment. This miraculous pivot was fueled by forward-thinking evidence preservation colliding directly with 21st-century scientific wizardry. Armed with absolute certainty, the state presented this nightmare to a grand jury. The panel formally indicted Perry for massacring both Pamela and her sibling, their tragedies irreversibly tied to his genetic code. Dragged through the unforgiving machinery of the court, he was finally found guilty of every heinous allegation. The presiding judge handed down a crushing mandate: life behind bars plus 100 years. This mathematical certainty guaranteed the predator would draw his final breath, confined entirely within concrete walls. Such severe punishment mirrored the profound darkness of extinguishing two innocent souls under highly aggravated, horrifying conditions. For a grieving family, the verdict delivered a phantom-like justice they had desperately chased for over 30 years. Watching the architect of their nightmare face, total ruin offered a fragile, irreplaceable sense of closure. They could finally sleep knowing this specific terror would never stalk the night again. It stands as a chilling testament to archiving crime scenes. Dormant secrets often wait patiently for the future to decode them. The psychological horror of Pamela's slaughter was that her executioner simply walked away, living freely across borders for decades. Masked by perfect normalcy, he remained an active, lurking threat to countless other vulnerable women. It begs a haunting question: how much collateral bloodshed could an earlier capture have spared? As of 2025, he rots in a cell. Another tragedy elsewhere demanded the exact same technological sorcery. Then came Helene Prushinsky. On January 16, 1980, 21-year-old Helene was discovered discarded in the desolate rural stretches of Douglas County, Colorado. A bright-eyed radio intern, she possessed an undeniable spark for journalism, a vibrant future brutally extinguished before it truly began. Snatched from the street during a routine walk home, her discarded remains surfaced less than 24 hours later. This brazen violation completely paralyzed the Denver metro area with fear, sparking a relentless manhunt. Crime scene technicians meticulously harvested microscopic clues from both the frozen earth and Helene's violated form. Crucially, they cataloged a minute trace of the killer's biology, freezing it for a much more advanced tomorrow. Despite exhaustive interrogations and countless desperate theories, the phantom culprit slipped entirely through their fingers. Shackled by the primitive policing tools of 1980, detectives watched Helene's murder grow agonizingly cold for almost 40 years. Yet, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office absolutely refused to let her memory fade into the dust. Generations of detectives obsessively reviewed the dusty files, praying the long silence would finally break. Still, it devolved into one of Colorado's darkest riddles, a brilliant girl robbed of tomorrow, leaving only agonizing questions. After decades of bitter injustice, a monumental breakthrough arrived in 2019 via revolutionary genealogical tracking. The assailant's lingering genetic fingerprint was injected into public databases, weaponizing his own distant bloodline against him. This inescapable digital web inevitably snared a man named James Curtis Clanton. A transient truck driver hiding behind a fabricated identity, he harbored a sickeningly familiar record of sexual violence elsewhere. Digging deeper into his shadow exposed a terrifying, pitch-black psychological profile. His dark history included brutal interstate assault convictions matching the exact same pathology. Like a ghost, he weaponized fake names to drift invisibly through America, leaving quiet tragedy completely in his wake. His life behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler provided the perfect cover: endless highways, complete anonymity, and the sinister advantage of crossing state lines before local detectives could even begin piecing the puzzle together. Handcuffs finally snapped onto Clanton's wrists, marking the beginning of his mandatory transport back to Colorado to answer for the horrors inflicted upon Helen. The prosecution's arsenal was devastating, a flawless biological link forged through cutting-edge ancestral mapping, bolstered by geographic data planting him precisely at ground zero when the unthinkable occurred. Inside the sterile confines of the courtroom, attorneys laid out a labyrinth of undeniable forensic proof, weaving it seamlessly with compelling behavioral anomalies that shackled the defendant directly to the grim scene. The gavel fell with absolute finality, a guaranteed lifetime behind concrete walls, permanently erasing any hope of freedom. For the victim's grieving relatives, it brought a profound exhale, a hard-won closure after decades in the dark. As one loved one bitterly observed, the young woman's promising future was stolen right before it truly began. That guilty verdict acted as an airtight seal on his fate, guaranteeing he would draw his final breath surrounded by steel bars. The terrifying reality lurking beneath the surface was his chameleon-like existence, operating under a web of false identities while drifting across the asphalt arteries of America, dodging capture for decades. A chilling breadcrumb trail of interstate violence strongly indicated that Helen was far from his only prey during those many unchecked years on the prowl. It became a landmark demonstration of how familial DNA sequencing acts as the ultimate spotlight, exposing monsters who had masterfully slipped through the cracks of conventional criminal tracking systems and existed strictly in the shadows. As the calendar turned to 2025, he remained securely locked away in a cell, rotting under the weight of his permanent sentence. Our next descent into the archives exposes yet another predator who seamlessly masqueraded as an ordinary citizen. The tragedy of Anna Jean Kane. On the grim morning of March 14, 1988, Pennsylvania detectives stumbled upon a macabre tableau in Lackawanna County, the lifeless form of a 26-year-old woman. She was a devoted young mother with deep local roots, diligently striving to carve out a quiet, stable existence for her loved ones. The savage nature of the scene screamed homicide, triggering a relentless and sprawling manhunt to unearth the phantom responsible for her brutal end. Crime scene technicians meticulously harvested every microscopic clue left behind, sealing away precious biological traces that would sleep dormant in evidence lockers. Yet, the element that elevated this case into the realm of the profoundly bizarre arrived in the form of a mysterious piece of mail, a cryptic dispatch that would ultimately become the Rosetta Stone for detectives. Penned by the very hands stained with her blood, the chilling correspondence was laced with arrogant confessions and, crucially, microscopic biological signatures that would wait silently for science to catch up. Even with a mountain of physical clues and the killer's brazen note, authorities found themselves staring at a blank wall, severely handicapped by the primitive technological limits of 1988. The trail froze solid as every promising whisper dissolved into nothingness. But the sheer audacity of a killer leaving a written manifesto kept a flickering flame of hope alive among the task force. They knew the ghost could be unmasked. It was only a matter of waiting for laboratory science to evolve enough to pull a genetic fingerprint from the paper. For an agonizing 34 years, her surviving relatives were trapped in a purgatory of unanswered questions, painfully aware that the key was sitting in an evidence box just out of reach. That solitary envelope injected a deeply psychological venom into the narrative, being the ultimate power trip from a phantom who felt completely untouchable, openly mocking the badge while hiding in the shadows. The silence finally broke in 2022, when revolutionary forensic breakthroughs managed to pull a clean biological profile from the aged stationery. Analysts unleashed this newly minted blueprint into vast ancestral networks, letting complex family tree mapping do the heavy lifting. The digital web ensnared a man named Scott Grimm, a local resident trailing a long, dark history of deeply unsettling conduct and a prior stint in cuffs for stalking. His geographic closeness to the slaughter, paired with an already disturbing behavioral profile, painted a giant target on his back. The moment the ancestral algorithms whispered his name, cold case units immediately revisited the victim's garments, heavily guarded, since the initial crime scene, uncovering even more biological traces identical to the suspect. The convergence of saliva from the envelope, fabric stains, and advanced familial mapping built an inescapable fortress of guilt around him. Yet, mirroring other dark chapters in investigative history, a courtroom reckoning was entirely out of reach. Grimm had taken his final breath in 2018 from entirely mundane causes, cheating justice by a mere 4 years. His expiration meant that while the puzzle was officially solved and the agonizing void of the unknown was filled for her loved ones, the satisfying echo of a gavel and the sight of him facing a judge would remain forever elusive. The revelation offered a profound, bittersweet exhale for her kin, yet it birthed a lingering, unanswerable nightmare, understanding the true motive behind such a depraved act. That mocking dispatch he carelessly mailed off the very thing that sealed his posthumous fate, exposed a twisted psyche dripping with narcissism, a monster utterly obsessed with broadcasting his own atrocities to the world, harboring the arrogant delusion of eternal anonymity. Authorities formally shuttered the investigation, marking it exceptionally cleared an administrative finality brought on solely by the killer's demise. The chilling reality remained that the phantom who extinguished Anna Jean's light wandered freely for another 3 decades, haunting the exact same neighborhoods, somehow evading the crosshairs of justice even after a prior harassment conviction. His mocking correspondence dripped with pathological narcissism, reflecting an absolute certainty that he was untouchable, an arrogance validated for more than 30 years, shattered only when the relentless march of genetic science finally unmasked him. By 2025, this investigation stands as a monumental testament to modern genetic genealogy, proving how a single macabre letter can harbor the biological key to unlocking decades-old mysteries. As we continue to descend into the most unsettling criminal archives, ensure you remain tethered to our investigations by following this journey into the abyss. Our subsequent file exposes an apex predator, one whose pathological compulsions left a devastating trail of shattered lives. Shannon Rose Lloyd. The year was 1987 when law enforcement officials in Orange County, California, were confronted with the grim discovery of a 17-year-old girl discarded in the shadows of Garden Grove. She possessed a future brimming with potential, a bright flame violently snuffed out by an opportunist lurking in the darkness. Her file would languish in the purgatory of unsolved mysteries for more than 30 years. Yet, its eventual closure would unmask a chronic butcher who systematically preyed upon others while effortlessly sidestepping the law. The macabre signature left at her crime scene closely echoed a cluster of other local tragedies from that era, whispering a sinister possibility. A phantom menace was actively hunting across the county lines. Technicians meticulously gathered physical traces from the grim tableau, freezing biological fragments in time through the primitive scientific protocols of the late 1980s. Even with a relentless dragnet, the shadow remained nameless. Promising avenues dried up, leaving the investigation to gather dust in the archives. Detectives tirelessly interrogated neighbors, acquaintances, and transient witnesses, hunting for the slightest anomaly near the desolate patch where her remains surfaced. Investigators chased down every plausible hypothesis and phantom tip. However, the scientific limitations of that decade rendered them blind, unable to decode the genetic whispers hidden within the biological debris. The dossier never completely closed, subjected to periodic scrutiny by generations of detectives praying for an elusive breakthrough. 3 agonizing decades passed with her loved ones trapped in an agonizing void, oblivious to the monster's identity or the true scope of his carnage. Ultimately, the meticulous safeguarding of those decades-old cellular traces became the pivotal linchpin, patiently waiting for forensic science to evolve into an omniscient tool capable of speaking for the dead. Secured within temperature-controlled vaults, these silent witnesses endured a 30-year slumber until technology finally breached the horizon. The tectonic shift occurred when revolutionary genetic sequencing permitted authorities to extract a pristine profile from those archaic samples. A routine swab, taken from a completely unrelated criminal apprehension, was algorithmically juxtaposed with the ghost profile, triggering a devastating match that crowned Reuben Smith as the architect of her demise. Peeling back the layers of his existence unleashed a torrent of deeply unsettling revelations. Fleeing the California coast for the neon glare of Las Vegas post-murder, he had quietly continued his horrific campaign of violence against women. His meticulously crafted savagery bore the undeniable hallmark of an apex sociopath, stalking the marginalized and defenseless through the shadows across multiple states. Authorities soon unearthed the chilling testimony of a lone survivor, a woman who had miraculously torn herself from his lethal grip, cementing the grim reality of his deeply ingrained predatory compulsions. Yet, the catharsis of a courtroom reckoning would forever remain a mirage. The coward had orchestrated his own exit in 1999, pulling the trigger decades before a microscopic strand of DNA could formally condemn him. Extinguishing himself roughly 12 years following the murder, he carried the dark secret of her slaughter for over 3,000 days before opting out. The precise psychological catalyst for his final act was buried with him, occurring in an era entirely oblivious to the genetic revolution that would eventually trace his bloody footprints. A bitter aftertaste plagued law enforcement and grieving relatives alike, haunted by a monster who effortlessly threw away human souls and cheated earthly retribution. One detective grimly highlighted the absolute sociopathic indifference he displayed toward the flesh and blood he destroyed. The sheer magnitude of his carnage, permanently linking him to another corpse and a traumatized escapee, finally exposed the staggering depth of depravity defining his quiet, blood-soaked reign of terror. The file was ultimately stamped closed, marked with an exceptional clearance, a hollow victory born solely from the perpetrator's demise. Relatives of Shannon were handed a grim resolution, forever robbed of the profound closure of watching Smith stand before a judge. The chilling reality clawed its way to the surface. Smith was no isolated monster, but a relentless, prolific predator. A phantom drifting across borders, forever stalking vulnerable women in the shadows. Taking his own life in 1999, he cowardly cheated justice, slipping away right before modern genetics could trap him. By 2025, Shannon's tragedy remains just one piece of a sprawling puzzle, tethered to Smith by forensic science long after his grave was dug. Yet, the shadows of the next investigation would swallow two innocent souls, sparking a forensic revolution. The tragic tale of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg. As winter loomed in November 1987, 18-year-old Jay and 20-year-old Tanya crossed the border from British Columbia. Venturing into Washington state, they embarked on a seemingly mundane errand for Tanya's father, a trip that ended in pure terror. That homebound journey never happened. Their shattered remains were eventually unearthed in starkly different landscapes. Time ticked by before Jay surfaced in Snohomish County, with Tanya located miles away in Skagit, both subjected to unimaginable brutality. Detectives pieced together a grim timeline. The pair was cruising in Jay's van when they crossed paths with pure evil. The desolate vehicle was subsequently recovered, yielding a silent reservoir of microscopic clues harvested from both the interior and the dumping grounds. Hidden within that trace material lay biological secrets destined to crack the mystery wide open generations down the line. 1987's primitive labs were blind to the DNA's true narrative, forcing a sprawling coalition of detectives to hunt in the dark. Endless interrogations and exhausted theories yielded absolutely nothing. The phantom responsible remained entirely out of reach. It curdled into one of the Pacific Northwest's most agonizing, deeply haunting dual enigmas. Two vibrant futures obliterated, leaving grieving relatives to drown in a 30-year void of silence and maddening questions. When the fracture in the case finally occurred, it shattered the boundaries of modern criminalistics. Fast forward to 2018, desperate investigators fed the killer's genetic footprint into GED match, weaponizing civilian ancestry records against the unknown. It stood as a pioneering triumph, proving that tracing family bloodlines could effectively unmask a lethal predator. Riding the shockwaves of the Golden State Killer revelation, this method proved its terrifying, relentless efficacy. Scientists wove intricate, multi-generational webs from distant cousins who had merely submitted their saliva to trace their own heritage. Those sprawling branches pointed straight to William Earl Talbot II, a commercial trucker prowling that exact territory back then. Digging deeper, unearthed a sinister past, exposing a man intimately familiar with the cold steel of a prison cell. Navigating the highways as a trucker granted him the ultimate deadly camouflage of constant motion. Shadowing his every move, detectives covertly snatched a piece of his trash, securing the biological nail in his coffin. The genetic data was an undeniable avalanche, locking him to the massacre with terrifying certainty. Handcuffs clicked shut, indictments were handed down, and the long-awaited courtroom battle officially commenced. Inside those walls, state attorneys unleashed the devastating genealogical tree alongside irrefutable microscopic clues. Defense lawyers scrambled to cry foul over privacy violations, yet the judiciary firmly validated the groundbreaking investigative science. A jury's verdict condemned him to rot behind bars forever, stripping away any lingering hope of future freedom. Law enforcement confessed that his name was just another whisper in the wind, chased down with the same agonizing precision as the rest. For the grieving relatives, a heavy, 30-year shroud of torment was at last violently lifted. The chilling core of the nightmare, a butcher had blended seamlessly into society, breathing free air while his victims decayed. His comfort within the penal system heavily hinted that the darkness inside him had never truly gone dormant. The open highway, his personal hunting ground, offered terrifying freedom that likely masked even more untold atrocities. Fast forward to 2025, the monster remains caged, slowly drowning in his endless, iron-barred reality. This victory cemented itself as a colossal milestone, proving invisible bloodlines could resurrect the coldest of dead trails. Yet another frozen mystery was waiting in the wings, destined to be shattered by an entirely different scientific miracle. The chilling echoes of Michella Welch. March 1986 cast a morbid shadow over Tacoma, Washington, when sirens descended upon a park harboring a juvenile corpse. She had vanished while playing there mere hours prior, triggering a hysterical, desperate neighborhood sweep by terrified loved ones. Finding her lifeless frame sparked an obsessive, 30-year manhunt that only modern genetic sorcery could finally bring to a close. Investigators meticulously gathered microscopic clues from the scene and the wronged victim. They secured vital biological traces using rudimentary preservation methods from the mid-1980s. Detectives launched an exhaustive inquiry, questioning parkgoers, neighbors, and anyone catching a glimpse of suspicious shadows. Despite this relentless pursuit and the Tacoma authorities' absolute dedication, the elusive figure remained a ghost. Detectives were profoundly hindered by the primitive tools of their era. For 32 years, the file lay dormant, one of Tacoma's most chilling enigmas. Meanwhile, a devastated family clung fiercely to the fragile hope of future justice. They consistently pressured law enforcement and organized solemn vigils, refusing to let the tragedy fade. In 2009, local police finally established a specialized cold case division. This nightmare immediately became top priority for intense review. The earth-shattering breakthrough finally arrived in 2018. Advanced genetic genealogy was applied directly to the decaying evidence. Experts fed the suspect's profile into genealogical databases, meticulously constructing complex family trees to trap their phantom. This painstakingly detailed biological puzzle ultimately pointed to a single name: Gary Charles Hartman. Hartman had been lurking quietly as a nurse, hiding his dark history behind a perfect mask of everyday normalcy. A deep dive into his background unearthed a fractured psychological history. Investigators uncovered early life traumas that seemingly warped his psychology, intertwined with severe, lifelong addiction battles. Yet, none of these psychological origins could ever justify the sheer depravity of his unforgivable transgressions. Detectives desperately needed undeniable proof, a direct genetic sample covertly obtained from the suspect himself. The ultimate trap sprang during intense surveillance when agents watched him discard a crumpled paper napkin. Forensic analysis of that discarded item revealed a chilling, exact match to the old evidence, cementing his involvement with scientific certainty. Authorities swiftly apprehended Hartman, formally charging him with ending that young life 32 years earlier. As legal walls closed in, the accused allegedly whispered dark statements to a workplace colleague. He casually discussed the cold case, essentially confessing his dark involvement. Those careless whispers, fused with irrefutable genetic proof, created an impenetrable case for the prosecution. Choosing to avoid trial, he pleaded guilty, finally answering for the darkness he unleashed 3 decades prior. During sentencing, the offender directly addressed the court and the shattered family. He hollowly proclaimed that a higher power knew the profound remorse for his actions. But those empty words arrived decades too late to soothe the immense generational trauma or restore what was violently stolen. A judge handed down 26.5 years, balancing the sheer gravity of a stolen life against his advanced age in the passing decades. By 2025, the aging figure remains securely incarcerated, serving out his sentence. The next case involved another horrifying incident, shrouded in its own unique, macabre details. The next tragic victim was Jennifer Bastian. In August 1986, mere months after the first tragedy, panic erupted at a different park when a child vanished mid-bike ride. The young girl pedaled off into the afternoon, never returning to the safety of home. This ignited a frantic search involving terrified family members, determined volunteers, and exhausted law enforcement. Weeks later, the grim unearthing of her remains materialized their darkest fears, birthing another agonizing, decades-long investigation. Eerily, this fresh horror mirrored the chilling hallmarks of the previous local tragedy from that March. Paranoia gripped the city, sparking terrifying rumors that a single, deranged figure was stalking their neighborhoods. Yet, the cold science of forensics eventually proved that two entirely separate, deeply disturbed individuals were responsible. The chilling reality was far worse. The city harbored two distinct, dangerous actors operating independently within months. Investigators painstakingly collected evidence, meticulously preserving biological traces found deeply embedded within a discarded swimsuit. Detectives furiously processed countless desperate clues pouring in from a terrified community. They relentlessly questioned potential witnesses, exploring complex, shifting psychological theories. Despite a relentless crusade by the Cold Case Squad formed in 2009, the perpetrator remained a total phantom for years. The monumental turning point finally arrived when revolutionary genetic tracking techniques were unleashed in 2015. Deep within the sprawling molecular analysis, a single, terrifying surname bubbled up: Washburn. This crucial breakthrough narrowed the crosshairs of detectives, locking their sights on anyone bearing that specific surname who haunted the Tacoma vicinity back in 1986. Eventually, the sprawling web of clues converged on a single, unassuming target: Robert D. Washburn. A localized shadow during the era of the killings, he had since slipped quietly away, relocating to the quiet streets of Eureka, Illinois. In a chilling twist, Washburn had proactively dialed law enforcement months prior, offering up a phantom tip regarding the preceding March tragedy. It was a calculated masquerade, playing the role of a deeply concerned citizen desperate to safeguard his community. Yet, seasoned investigators recognize this psychological game. Perpetrators frequently inject themselves into active inquiries, a morbid arrogance signaling intimate, guilty knowledge of parallel horrors. Once the miraculous science of genetic genealogy tethered Washburn irrevocably to the August atrocity, detectives immediately resurrected the memory of his suspicious intrusion into the March investigation. Digging deeper, unearthed a fatal error. Washburn had willingly surrendered his genetic blueprint back in 1985 during a completely separate police inquiry. Dusting off that decades-old vial and pitting it against biological traces extracted from the victim's swimsuit yielded an absolute, undeniable match. He had surrendered that saliva 33 years prior, blissfully unaware it would become the invisible thread unraveling his darkest secret. That forgotten vial morphed into the ultimate damnation, cementing his guilt. By 2018, the long arm of justice finally snatched Washburn, formally charging him with the brutal slaying of the innocent child. Opting to dodge the glaring lights of a trial, he entered a guilty plea, quietly swallowing the consequences of a nightmare he orchestrated 32 years prior. A judge handed down a crushing 27-year sentence, guaranteeing this predator would wither away behind iron bars until his dying breath. The grieving mother broke her silence, revealing a fierce, unyielding hope that had kept her spirit alive through decades of suffocating darkness. She voiced profound relief that the ghosts of the past were finally laid to rest. The grim reality, entangling those two 1986 Tacoma tragedies, had paralyzed the hunt, tricking detectives into chasing a single phantom killer when two distinct monsters were actually roaming the streets. Furthermore, Washburn's sinister gamble to inject himself into the March manhunt by feeding authorities a fabricated lead exposed a deeply fractured, psychopathic hunger for control. He craved a front-row seat to the police probe, meticulously guarding the shadows that concealed his own August bloodbath. Fast forward to 2025, and Washburn remains securely caged, serving out his bitter penance. Yet, the harrowing tale of Tracy Gilpin is a different beast entirely, a labyrinth of secrets, stubbornly defying full closure even decades after the fact. That same blood-stained year, 1986, Massachusetts law enforcement plunged into the chilling vanishing of 15-year-old Tracy Gilpin, Last spotted wandering the quiet stretch of Chelmsford, her mysterious disappearance would soon culminate in a horrifying grim discovery. What followed was a paralyzing web of contradictory suspects, convoluted alibis, and fractured theories that would choke the justice system for generations. Unmasking her true assailant triggered a grueling odyssey of dead ends and fierce courtroom battles, a legal nightmare stretching relentlessly into 2025. Detectives methodically pieced together her final hours, confirming Tracy had mingled with a shadowy cast of characters. All of this unfolded on the very eve of her sudden, terrifying erasure from the world. The grim recovery site offered up cryptic clues, fragments of biological trace and physical debris meticulously sealed in evidence vaults for a future where science could speak. Swirling with endless suspects and conflicting motives, the riddle mutated into one of the most notoriously impenetrable cold cases in Massachusetts history. A baffling forensic anomaly paralyzed the inquiry. The microscopic DNA clinging to the victim's garments vehemently excluded their prime target. This staggering mismatch birthed terrifying new questions, shattering the timeline and hinting at unseen accomplices lurking in the periphery. Furthermore, the autopsy unveiled a brutal method of destruction, pointing toward a shockingly dense, blunt instrument. The murder weapon was a monstrous 73-pound boulder, wielded with enough savage fury to inflict catastrophic trauma. Hefting such massive weight required sickening dedication, implying a cold, calculated premeditation that sent shudders through the precinct. For an agonizing 30 years, Tracy's shattered family waged a relentless crusade for truth, hunting the phantom who stole her future. Her sister eventually took to the podium, voice trembling with cautious optimism, as sudden forensic leaps promised a long overdue reckoning. Detectives were forced to dissect a dizzying array of competing narratives. Suspicion frequently pivoted, dragging names like McLean and Meinholz under the intense, unforgiving glare of the interrogation lamp over the years. The psychological stalemate finally broke in 2018 when authorities slapped handcuffs on Michael Hand, formally leveling charges. He was indicted for Tracy's gruesome demise. Yet his profile was an enigma. He suffered from profound cognitive deficits. Burdened by borderline intelligence, scattered memory, and volatile impulses, his rap sheet was otherwise a mundane collection of petty infractions. But the sinister red flag lay in his trade for 20 years. He survived independently by carving and manipulating heavy stone. Most damning of all, Hand's own residence served as the focal point of her final night, a house where Tracy gathered just hours before the darkness swallowed her. Behind closed doors in the interrogation room, Hand supposedly uttered words construed as a confession, even muttering something about hurling a stone. Yet, those very utterances would eventually trigger a fierce and forensic legal battle over their validity. Detectives subjected him to the cold wiring of lie detectors and relentless hours of probing inquiries. The psychological pressure cooker stretched across numerous grueling sit-downs with investigators. Ultimately, the sheer exhaustion and psychological toll of those marathon sessions would be weaponized by the defense to cast doubt on everything he said. By October of 2024, the case experienced a massive procedural earthquake. An appeals judge took the drastic step of throwing out an admission he had whispered to a clergyman, declaring that the revelation was the poisoned fruit of his earlier, highly coercive police interrogations. The bench ruled that detectives had essentially broken his resolve through sheer exhaustion, irrevocably tainting his later spiritual admission with their heavy-handed tactics. Losing that pivotal piece of evidence threw a massive wrench into the state's meticulously built prosecution strategy. Fast forward to 2025, and the legal quagmire still drags on without an end in sight, with his actual trial paralyzed in a purgatory of endless appeals and bitter disputes over what a jury can actually hear. Repeatedly denied release, he sits behind bars, waiting for the sluggish wheels of justice to finally turn. Meanwhile, forensic profiles that completely exclude him hover like ghosts over the investigation, hinting at shadowy accomplices or dark secrets yet to be unearthed. The grim reality of Tracy's murder is that, despite finally putting someone in handcuffs back in 2018, more than 3 decades after her life was stolen, the courtroom battle is still hopelessly gridlocked in 2025. Discarded admissions and a labyrinth of contradictory DNA have cast a long, chilling shadow over the possibility of ever securing real closure. But the last file in our descent into madness unveils a twist so sinister it defies belief. Her name was Christine Jessop. Back in October 1984, Canadian detectives descended upon the quiet community of Queensville, searching frantically for a vanished child. She had seemingly evaporated into thin air while left unsupervised in her own house. Finding her body weeks later ignited what would become one of the most infamous and hotly debated manhunts in Canadian history. The twisted saga that followed would feature a catastrophic miscarriage of justice, decades of dead ends, and a gut-wrenching final unmasking of the true monster. Early police tunnel vision locked onto Guy Paul Morin, a young man who lived right next door to the grieving family. Though he screamed his innocence from the rooftops, the system locked him away in a cold cell anyway. But he refused to be broken, waging a relentless war against his own guilty verdict from the inside, and eventually, microscopic genetic profiling shattered the state's illusion, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had the wrong man. Cleared of all charges, he walked free into the daylight, later receiving a massive payout for the years the state stole from him. But while one innocent man got his life back, detectives and a shattered family were thrust violently back to square one. The trail went ice cold for decades, leaving only an anonymous genetic signature mocking investigators from the evidence locker. Those vials of truth sat dormant in deep freeze, biding their time until science could catch up to the killer. The dam finally broke in 2020 when forensic analysts fed that anonymous profile into GE Deadmatch, the very same ancestral matrix that had been quietly unmasking phantom killers all across the continent. The digital family tree pointed its finger at a man named Calvin Hoover, locking him to the crime scene biology with terrifying precision. The name sent shockwaves through the department. This was no stranger in the night, but an accepted friend who had broken bread with the victims. Peeling back the layers of his seemingly ordinary life exposed a rotting, deeply psychological nightmare. Like a spider in the corner, he had quietly obsessed over the manhunt, watching with morbid fascination as authorities hunted down and caged his innocent neighbor. He played the role of a devoted husband flawlessly, burying his unspeakable sins beneath a veneer of suburban normalcy. The sheer malice required to stand by in absolute silence while another man rotted for his atrocities made the psychological profile all the more chilling. Yet, putting him in handcuffs and parading him before a judge was a satisfaction no one would ever get. In 2015, at the age of 59, he had already served as his own executioner, checking out 5 years before the ancestral algorithms finally cornered him. He took the exact motive for his suicide to the grave, extinguishing his own life long before the long arm of science ever tapped him on the shoulder. When the police ultimately stepped to the podium to name the true predator, the grieving father confessed an overwhelming horror at realizing the devil had been hiding in plain sight among their inner circle. The crushing knowledge that a trusted companion had butchered their child and then smiled in their faces for years left a psychological scar that no amount of closure could ever heal. Detectives exploring his shadowy past found chilling parallels to other unresolved mysteries, including Nicole Morin's vanishing. The grim implication pointed toward Hoover, harboring other hidden, unspeakable atrocities. The press ultimately branded him as pure, unadulterated malice. His depravity went far beyond extinguishing a youthful soul. He silently oversaw the devastating imprisonment of a blameless scapegoat. The exposed psychological reality was deeply, chillingly layered. Operating from the inner circle, Hoover weaponized their trust to execute a devastatingly gruesome, intimate betrayal. For decades, he watched from the shadows, maintaining a chilling silence while another man faced ruin. He cheated justice, ending his life right before modern forensics could finally unmask him. As of 2025, this saga serves as a haunting testament to how genetic forensics expose profound miscarriages of justice. It leaves a lingering outrage, the chilling realization that the monster took his secrets to the grave, evading true accountability.